Okay, we are moving right along here in Thomas Pynchon's Oeuvre to The Crying of Lot 49, which is his shortest novel. And it's the one novel that I think most people read first who are curious about Pynchon and want to sample him. It's minimal investment. It's easy to read. You can get in, get out. It's just under 200 pages, 6 chapters, and it's not too difficult to read at all. This was the first Pynchon novel that I read as an undergraduate English major in college. And it does indeed distill in a very concise form a lot of his main ideas. Whereas we had seen with V, the primary concern was the descent into the inanimate, how the mechanical world has dehumanized the humanity of human beings. In this novel, we shift more into the realm of communications, information theory, and electronics. So this novel is more of a media studies novel that is more about the analog media that come into being with postmodernity, the radio, cassettes, vinyl, all the sort of analog television. It has to do with that whole world there, the realm of communications. And so it's a great media studies novel. And now the title. So The Crying of Lot 49, on the literal level, will refer to an auction that takes place at the end of the novel regarding this lot 49 and the bidding on it that will take place. But of course the 49 actually refers to Pentecost, which we already saw in the last chapter of V. Pynchon was playing around with the idea of Pentecost. Pentecost is of course the 50th day after the 49 days that follow Passover, traditionally. But in the Acts, and I want to read this from the Acts, Acts of the Apostles, it gets reterritorialized by the Christians to refer to a different event here. It's not just the giving of the law on the 50th day after Passover, but now has to do with the 50th day after the death and resurrection of Christ. And it says here in Acts 2, when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly a sound came from heaven like the rush of a mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting, and there appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributed and resting on each one of them, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. And so the Spirit descends in tongues of flame, and each one of these tongues alights onto one of the individual remaining 11 apostles. Judas is dead and hasn't been replaced yet. And each one can now speak in a different language so they can disseminate the gospel, the good news, through all the different tongues, as the next paragraph indicates. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound, the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one heard them speaking in his own language. And they were amazed and wondered, saying, are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God. And so the myth, in a way, is meant to counter the myth of the Tower of Babel, which is in the book of Genesis, where they're building a tower apparently to storm heaven, and God sees this and strikes the tower down and prevents them from building it by confusing them with a babel of different tongues so that nobody can understand each other. So that they can't all cooperate from the different ethnicities and build this tower. In a way, the Christians reverse this, since the Hebrew message is of ethnicity. It matters who your mother is. It matters what your descent by blood is. Not so in Christianity, where we want a babel of tongues. We want as many different ethnicities as possible to build this new Tower of Babel, which is the Logos, the Word made flesh, that is now accessible to anyone and everyone. It is no longer ethno-specific. So that's the whole point of the myth, is to reverse Hebrew ethnicity and specificity to a generalized Magian consensus. So that's the myth that Pynchon is alluding to here in this book, since it's about communication theory. And Gabriel, in the Christian tradition, is the sort of patron saint of communications. That's his area, that's his sphere of influence, is communications. Gabriel has the horn, and when the apocalypse is supposed to come, he blows the horn to announce the coming of the apocalypse. Now that horn becomes the symbol of an organization in this book called the Tristero, which may or may not exist. Once again, we have Pynchon not committing himself one way or the other to the existence of the Tristero. He leaves that up to the reader to figure out for himself, or herself as the case may be. And so Gabriel has displaced Mercury, what would have been Mercury / Hermes, Hermes for the Greeks, Mercury for the Romans, in the ancient world, who was the god associated with writing and communications. And then back behind him would be the Egyptian god Tot, the god of the underworld, who is also associated with writing. But also there's another Egyptian goddess associated with writing named Seshat. She is also associated with writing. Same thing with the Mesopotamians. There's a god and goddess there linked with writing, Nabu, who is Babylonian, who is brought in and displaces the much older Sumerian deity, Nezaba, who's the earliest goddess of writing that we know of. And then Nabu, the Babylonians bring her in as a sort of husband, but then he overshadows and displaces her and becomes associated with the planet Mercury. So those are the patron gods of writing and communication in the West. And it might be worth stopping for a second to sort of review, since this is a novel about media and communications, to review the history of the book, how it evolved and how writing evolved and what has happened and taken place here. I discussed this in my book, The New Media Invasion, in a chapter called A Miniature History of the Book, in which the oldest form of writing that we have comes to us from the city of Uruk, the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, 3500 BC, in which they're writing on these clay tablets. And the alluvial plain between the two rivers is resource poor. There's no wood there, really. There's no other medium, but there's clay. There's plenty of clay, and you can bake clay. Once you take a stylus and you draw little pictures on it, it can then be preserved almost permanently by baking it in a kiln and hardening it, and it's more or less permanent. It can last for thousands of years. We found the Gilgamesh epic in its almost entirety on these tablets, so they preserve very, very well. And at first, they're drawing pictures, but they pretty soon realize that pictures don't work drawing them on clay, because as you're writing with the reed stylus, your hand can smudge the pictures. So then they shift to a more abstract, almost Morse code-like punching with the stylus that's called then cuneiform. It comes from cuneus, meaning Latin wedge-shaped. So you just tap on the sort of Morse code-like thing going right to left, and then later they changed it actually from left to right. The Mesopotamians were the first to do that. And then that form of the book lasted all the way down to about 100 AD. So it lasted for a very, very long time. In Egypt, meanwhile, writing is associated with papyrus. The Egyptians had a monopoly on papyrus. And so you have the papyrus scroll, which is then laid out. And the writer is known as a sesh, from the goddess Seshat, who is associated with writing. He's known as a sesh, and he has a little toolkit, a wooden toolbox with a stylus in it and two forms of ink, red ink and black ink. And he mostly uses black ink to write on the papyrus scroll. It has the disadvantage of the fact that you can't write on the reverse side of it. You can only write on, let's say, the recto side, although recto and verso has no meaning for papyrus. It's a scroll. You write on it, you have these big long scrolls, and you can roll them up. They're very portable, easy to carry, lightweight, unlike the cuneiform tablets, which one can imagine would be very heavy if you got a bunch of them together. And so this form of writing lasts all the way down through the ancient world, all the way down to about 700 AD. Papyrus has a very long run. And alongside of it comes from the rival city of Alexandria, which is the great center of learning in the Delta Valley in Egypt. In the Hellenistic world, across the way there you have Pergamene. And so Pergamene originates parchment, which is writing now on animal skins, because Egypt has the monopoly on papyrus. So they're writing on parchment. And so it goes back and forth between parchment or vellum, which is another form of animal skins, writing on those for a very, very long time until the Romans invent the book, which is called a codex. And the Roman codices were initially just these sort of wooden framed things with a wax tablet on it that you could write on and also apply heat to erase it. And so what they would do is lay a handful of these together, one on top of the next, and hinge them. So that becomes the basis for the book, these hinged wooden tablets that you could then turn the pages for. Then this became the preferential mode, substituting parchment and vellum for these wooden tablets, the preferred mode for Christians. And so when we find Christian discoveries like at Nag Hammadi, we have the Nag Hammadi library, which is almost entirely written on these codices. The Jews, on the other hand, prefer the scrolls. So we find the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they retain the tradition of writing on papyrus scrolls. So then this is the preferred mode of the book, all the way down to the electronic book, to the Kindle and the ebook and so forth. This has been the book. And then with the printing press, which occurs in the 15th century, then with Gutenberg, we have mechanized printing. Print is, as McLuhan says, the sort of macadamization of writing such that the eye can just easily glide along the page. It's as though writing were now paved. We don't have to worry about the idiosyncrasies of handwriting. One guy's writing is not as good as another's and is therefore harder to read. It's all the same for everyone. Everyone can read it clearly. And so that, in a short, brief version, is a sort of history of the book, the way it has gone in the West anyway. Southeast Asia wrote on things like palm leaves and bamboo and silk and other things like that. But this is the way it has gone in the West. So it's worth keeping the history of media in mind as we were reading through this novel, because it is very much a novel about media, especially media in the postmodern world. So we have, in chapter 1 here, our first character is a woman named Oedipa Maas, who is a bored, lonely suburban housewife living in California here. And Oedipa Maas is an interesting name, of course. Oedipa is a feminization of the name of Oedipus, who in a way is history's first detective. He's the first one to go looking for clues as to his origin and to what has happened in his situation, which he finds out to his horror is catastrophic. So Oedipa then, and she's the first of Pynchon's female detectives, the most recent one being the female private investigator in Bleeding Edge. So this is a tradition in Pynchon's writing. Maas is a Dutch word meaning woof or warp, which refers to the mesh of a text. And that idea of the text on the one hand and the textile on the other, the cloth fabric which is also woven, just as originally papyrus was woven through strips of papyrus laid vertically and laid horizontally and pounded with a hammer and then set out to dry. There's a warp and a weft there, also with papyrus. So text and textile are very closely interconnected. So this is Oedipa Maas. She has just come home from a Tupperware party, the absolute apotheosis of the bored consumer housewife. And she finds out that she has been named executrix of one Pierce, of the estate of one Pierce Inverarity. His name means pierce on the one hand, but inverarity is a pun. It can mean piercing to the truth, in the truth, inverarity or untruth, classic Pynchon antinomy. But this book will also have to do with the origins of the post office and the postal service. Stamp collecting will be involved in here. And in the world of stamp collecting, an inverse rarity is a special type of stamp. But he's a real estate mogul, a very rich man, whom she had been dating. She's married right now, to a guy named Mucho Maas, who is a disc jockey. He works as a disc jockey, but he used to be a used car salesman. So note the shift there from the realm of V, which was the realm of mechanical things and the inanimate, to now the realm of analog media, communications media, electronics media. He's a DJ at a record station. KCUF is the name of his record station. And but she was dating Pierce Inverarity for about a year before she met this guy. And so they had a relationship. They went down to Mexico, did all this romantic stuff, and then eventually they broke up. And so now he's died and mysteriously has left her to be the executor or executrix of his estate. And she doesn't know why. Why should she be left with all this money and have to allocate it and figure out who belongs to what debt needs to be paid where? So she has to sort all of this out. And so the novel on one level is about information overload that we have had to deal with in the age of electronic postmodernity. Hypermodernity is digital. We have, note with the different modernities, we have three different transformations of the world electric. Starting with the telegraph in the 1830s, we have in modernity phase one, the electric world. Writing is first plugged in and turned on with the telegraph. Writing is turned into sound with the application of electricity with the tap, tap, tap of the telegraph. That leads to the end of the century with the coming in of the telephone. Then into right about first decade or so, the coming in of radio, just as World War I is ending, then the coming in of NBC is the first of the national broadcasting corporations associated with radio, and it's all up and running, the whole electric Umwelt. With World War II and the coming in of postmodernity, we get the electronics industry that has come out of the Stanford research realm, which brought us things in World War II like radar systems. and of course eventually television, which explodes over the 1950s landscape as the great postmodern analog medium par excellence. And then with hypermodernity, now we have digitization. Everything is digitized. 3 different transformations of the Umwelt, electric, all things electric. And so we're introduced to her. She's inherited this estate. And then she has a law firm. It says the letter was from the law firm of Warp, Wistful, Kubitschek, and McMingus of Los Angeles, and signed by somebody named Metzger. So Metzger is to be the co-executor in charge of to help her with the estate on behalf of Pearson Verarity. Her lawyer is a schmuck named Roseman. He's almost totally useless. Now Metzger is important. Names are always important in Pynchon. Metzger is the German word for butcher, and the butchers actually in the Middle Ages were the sort of first postmen, because the butchers were peripatetic, they were itinerant, they were always wandering around, and because of that, they were given letters to deliver. And so they become the sort of beginnings of the postal system during the Middle Ages, dealing letters wherever they go from town to town, sort of like blacksmiths who are also itinerant, but butchers even more so. And the butcher also would carry a bugle with him to announce his coming into a town to buy cattle. So there's that bugle again that we saw with Gabriel's horn, and now will later be associated with the Tristero, the post horn. And then, so Pynchon will trace the evolution of the postal system through the aristocratic Turn and Taxis agency, their world, and then the Pony Express, and so on. So we'll see these transformations of the god Mercury, of Gabriel, as the novel unfolds, and it gives us this amazing history of the post office and its government monopoly with the Tristero. So the postal system with its monopoly will be an arborescent structure, a center-periphery structure, to use the terminology of Deleuze and Guattari, whereas the Tristero is a rhizomatic structure that is a counterforce to the arborescent structure of the monopoly that is based on the post office, and which wants to undermine it with a secret alternative underground system of communications between those who have been left out in society, what Pynchon calls the Praetorite, those who have been passed over by divine grace, the homeless, the bums, the poor, the outsiders, the marginalized, with whom Pynchon always has a sympathy. Even in V, we saw the beginnings of that. He always has a sympathy for those who have been passed over and left out, and the Tristero is designed specifically for them to communicate in underground ways, through graffiti, through secret messages. Or it may not exist at all, and in which case, Oedipa Maas is a kind of Herbert Stencil redux. She may be seeing patterns that might not be there. Pynchon's not going to tell us whether they're there or not. The novel ends hanging with the antinomy hanging in the air. Does the Tristero exist? Maybe there's some evidence for it. Does it not? Maybe it's all in Oedipa Maas's head, just as V might have been all in the head of Herbert Stencil. But unlike the characters Profane and Stencil, who are incapable of learning and learn nothing in the novel, Oedipa, on the other hand, does learn about herself and is about to be taken from her ivory tower of suburban isolation and thrust out into the world of the Praetorite, the world of nomads, the world of the lonely people. She ends up at the end of the novel totally isolated and alone. She loses all the men in her life, loses ironically, all forms of communication with other people as she ponders this existence for this underground communication system. A wonderful irony in this novel that she ends up totally isolated and alone. But she learns. And she thinks of herself in this chapter as a kind of Rapunzel figure up in a tower. And this is a key image. The tower is a key image in the novel, the way the street was, let's say, in V, where the street functioned as in de Chirico's painting, Mystery and Melancholy of a Street. That was the sort of key image there. Here we're going to have a painting by the Spanish painter named Maria Remedios Varo. She was a Spanish modernist painter who painted a triptych that will come in here at the end of this chapter that will serve as an analog for the situation with Oedipa. So she thinks of herself as this kind of Rapunzel figure, and she has this funny fancy as she's going along thinking about these things before she goes to see her lawyer, how she thought about Pearson Verarity as the prince who would climb up the tower and use her tresses. She would throw her tresses out like Rapunzel to pull him up. The only problem was she was wearing a wig, she imagines, and the wig comes loose and Verarity falls down on his ass. But he's smart, so he uses a credit card as a shim to unlock the door to the tower to get to her up that way. So she had thought that he would be the man who would rescue her from the tower, but it turns out that he wasn't. He turned out to be a disappointment. And so now at the end of the novel, she remembers a trip to Mexico that they took where she saw this exhibition and saw Remedios Varo's painting, this triptych, in which it's a very sort of surrealist image of three different images where you see in the first image this group of nuns riding bicycles being led by a man on a bicycle coming out of this castle. And then in the middle triptych now, which is the important one, they're up inside this tower, analogous to Rapunzel in her tower. It looks like there's 5 of them sitting around. They look like they might be scribes writing texts, with a man standing up behind them reading a book. So with the logocentric power of the word that he is pronouncing, he's commanding them to act. And there's a guy behind him with a pipe playing music. But their acting consists in making textiles. They're not writing a book. If you look closer, you see that each one is sitting in front of a loom, and they're weaving the textile of the world as the fabric comes out and drips out through cracks in the walls of the tower. The fabric, look this image up. It's easy to find on Google. Varo, V-A-R-O, triptych. And the folds come out, and as they come out, they create the world. Mountains and trees and castles. So they are weaving the world into being, these women, under the spell of the power of the word, the logos, which this individual is standing there in a monk robe dictating to them. But the woman wants to get out. There's one woman who has a lover who's trying to make his way up the tower, and then in the next painting, you see the 2 of them escaping. So he has saved her, like the prince tries and fails to save Rapunzel, but in this case, he saves her. And so Oedipa finds herself sympathizing with this woman who's trapped in the tower, and she wants out of the tower. She's stuck in this suburban world of bland consumerism. Her husband, Maas, was a used car salesman, and there's a long passage describing how he got sick of it because he got tired of one day seeming like the next, in which each person would bring him a crappy car, and he'd have to clean it out, and there'd be all this stuff in there, gold bond stamps, remember those? And photographs and broken records, and he would have to clean it out, and pretty soon it just piles up. This midden heap, this rubble heap, this junk pile. This is all entropy. And entropy is going to be one of the key ideas of the novel. Can entropy be reversed? It can't be reversed as far as we know in thermodynamic closed systems, but as far as communication theory, information theory goes, is there a way that human beings can reverse entropy? And that becomes the question here to be solved, since so much of consumer society is based on waste. And one of the acronyms for the Tristero will be WASTE, W-A-S-T-E, which will be an acronym for some, I forget what it is. We all await something. Well, we'll get to it. I'll find it. There's all this entropy, this consumer society, this postmodern, post-World War II consumer society is generating all this trash heaps of garbage, consumer crap, Tupperware parties. It's all information overload. And so the question of the novel becomes, how do we deal with information overload? And Marshall McLuhan is famous for having said, and McLuhan works very well as an interpreter for a novel like this, that information overload has a primary response, which is pattern recognition. But what he didn't say, and should also have said, is actually there are 2 responses to information overload. One is pattern recognition, but the other is paranoia. And paranoia is what happens when you have information overload and you resort to paranoid explanations, bizarre theories that try to account for all of these disconnected facts. So we get the age of conspiracy theories. Everything's a conspiracy. 911's a conspiracy. Everything becomes a conspiracy in the age of information overload because it's an attempt on the part of the hapless, overwhelmed human neocortex to put things into ordered systems. The other response, as McLuhan said, being pattern recognition, which can take the form of myth making. Myths are a way of taking information and organizing them into patterns. And so the important thing always is with Pynchon is patterns of organization and the disconnected signifiers that are constantly escaping these patterns, undermining them, distorting them, warping them, and how individuals create systems of what I call stealing from Deleuze and Guattari, where they say the state is an apparatus of capture. But there's this idea that I have in New Media Invasion that media are forms of apparatuses of semiotic capture. They take the surplus and the overload of systems and organize them Just as, for example, with the discovery of the New World, along came the signifier overload, where these voyages are all going out to the Americas, finding all these bizarre Native American artifacts, feathers and headdresses and eagle's wings, and then the paleontologists are finding all these new animals, dinosaur bones and trilobites and all these. Pretty soon we have signifier overload, and we have early forms of apparatuses of semiotic capture in the form of curiosity cabinets. So the curiosity cabinet comes into being along about the 17th century, places to put these disconnected signifiers. And then in the rooms of aristocrats, these cabinets would grow into entire rooms in their palaces, in which you would walk in and there would be works of Native American art and memorabilia, together with Chinese this and Chinese that, maybe Hindu Indian stuff, alligators maybe. And then pretty soon in the 19th century, we have to build larger apparatuses of semiotic capture to organize all this information overload in the form of museums. So then the Natural History Museum comes into being near the end of the 19th century. We get zoos to handle the animal signifier overload, and then we get museums to handle the cultural signifier overload. Museums of natural history and then museums of art history. That's what we have done with the surplus of information overload, is to create these forms of apparatuses of semiotic capture. Just as in the Middle Ages, the cathedrals were the first apparatuses of semiotic capture. Their walls are crawling with saints and myths, biblical myths and images and saints of this and saints of that. Signifier overload, but it's been organized by the apparatus of capture represented by the cathedral. So that's what this book is. It's a quest on the part of Oedipa Maas for an apparatus of semiotic capture that will make sense out of the postmodern information overload that she is dealing with and suffering from. And so that's the theme of this wonderful novel, and that's chapter 1 of The Crying of Lot 49.